media presentations to study this Afro-Mexican culture. So this is going to be about 200 years of Afro-Mexican history. He will share excerpts from his 2012 master's thesis from UCSB, focused on the field of research in Afro-Mexican region of Costa Chica and Oaxaca. More importantly, the presentation will highlight how the Black social movement recently in 2019 was able to obtain the constitutional recognition of census. The census, man, that's what they finally got into the census headcount. And that was in 2020. As a special guest, the presentation will interview Patricia Ann Talley, a member of both of Mexico Negro A.C. based in Guerrero, Mexico, and the Dr. Martin Luther King Task Committee. And following the presentation, there will be a community circle open to the public. So without any further ado, let me introduce one of the coolest guys I know and brilliant in his research, Jorge Gonzalez. Welcome, Jorge, and thank you for all you've done for the inclusion of Afro-Mexicans and Peruvians and that research here in this America and this part of America. How you doing? How you doing, Jorge? Can you hear me? I don't think Jorge, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great.
There we go.
There we go.
Thanks for the introduction, Makeda. Much love to everybody who's tuned in. Once again, thanks Patricia, Donahi, and our interpreter Juana, and the entire Worldbeat Center crew who's behind this, helping us out, transmitting in times of the quarantine, in times of COVID. This had been a vision of the Worldbeat Center and mine, us for a long time. Back in 2009, 2012, as I'm going to share in the presentation, I got to meet Father Glenn Jemmett, one of the founders of the Black social movement in Oaxaca, and also throughout the country now. And he predicted that the census would happen in 2010, if not 2010, 2020. So we knew we needed to do something about it, and we needed to really bring that message here to the California and to the United States. So, like Makeda said, it's been long coming of just collecting, following remotely from abroad, essentially from the United States, trying to understand the complexities of understanding the Black social movement and its uprising since, for the past 30 years. So hopefully through this presentation, we're able to really not only unpack the African presence in Mexico, because it's important to provide context, but it's also important for folks to really understand where Blackness and African descents really have left their footprint in history. And of course, this is not in historical books. So if you've learned this, if you learned Mexican history before, you might have to revisit history in a different way. And this is about decolonizing the mind and decolonizing history, which is we're living in times that are showing and our example of if we continue to move at this velocity and without clarity of what we're seeing in front of us, we still are living in the confines of colonial slavery, which is mental. So hopefully through this presentation, not only, which is going to be in two parts, I'm going to speak to the colonial presence with an emphasis more in the making of La Mexicanidad, which is very important to really unpack and understand how the systemizing Mexicanness or structural racism became a functionality in Mexico, and the making of Mexico as a nation has been very problematic and continues to really show its issues more so today than ever. So hopefully, as I take you through the presentation, we're going to be able to arrive to talk about the present moment in Mexico, and where Mexico Negro and leaders like Don Aji and Sergio Peñalosa, and who represent Mexico Negro, and also organizers who I'm in touch with AfricaAC, Asociación Civil, but I've been, very much in conversation with them, trying to understand its complexities. For me, it's important to really to understand, and so that people really understand the struggle, to really understand how long it's taken for us to arrive to where we're at now, where finally in Mexico in 2019, there was the recognition of the Black population by reforming the Constitution. So there's been a constitutional recognition, and I know Patricia and Don Aji will speak to it. It's a great victory, but that's just the beginning of a new chapter. And also the census headcount. It was occurring as we speak from in March till April. Then COVID happened, and that really impacted the response rates, which I'm gonna definitely pass it on to Patricia and Don Aji from Mexico Negro to speak on that, since they were very involved in that as well. And you might have already heard a lot through the media about the Black communities in Mexico getting counted. So it's important for people to really know the importance of these communities who live in marginalization, extreme poverty levels, with no representation and no inclusion in local public policies. And we're just seeing the beginnings of a constitutional reform that took, almost 300 years for it to arrive to where we're at now. Because we know, as the presentation will show, the Blackness and African presence in Mexico has been here since its beginnings, right? And even before, some would argue. So, like I said, this presentation will encompass the two parts of the presentation, and then we're going to have a discussion and presentation by Patricia and Don Aji from Mexico Negro. And then following that discussion, we're going to have the National Conflict Resolution, who will be leading a discussion of all the participants that are here. So if you're joining us on Facebook and YouTube, welcome. Go ahead and share it to your friends. Let others know we're about to get started. And again, if you can't be here for the full entirety of the presentation, know that it will be recorded and archived in the Worldbeat Center's YouTube channel, Worldbeat Productions. And again, I give credit to all the scholars who have put on all the work, who because of them and because of those in the front lines in Costa Chica, I'm able to really understand, the nuances of this movement. So first and foremost, I want to thank to all of those, who have been in the front lines, and also just all the scholarly work that's out there. So again, this presentation is called The Invisibilization of Blackness in Mexico and Struggle for Inclusion, because there's been a real attempt to invisibilize this history and this culture, a systematic change in place to create and erase Blackness from Mexican history. And that could be said around Latin America. But today we're not here for that. Today we're here to visibilize what's true and what needs to be said. So I want to start with this quote. This is by one of my mentors, Jack Forbes, co-founder of the Native American Studies movement here in the United States, who was one of the key scholars who educated me on Black and indigenous relationships. And what I love about this quote, it talks about naming, and he was big on naming because naming has history. Afro-Mexico as a term, as an identity term, it's complicated, it's complex, right? Just like Chicano, just like Mexican American, just like African American. So keep that in mind throughout the presentation. Every name has its own history and its complexities. So Jack Forbes was someone who I admired in my time at UC Davis, and really transformed and inspired the way I would look at the world. Sometimes upside down. He would love to turn maps around and put the United States to the left or to the right, because the history we've been fed has been very U.S. biased and U.S. focused at the center. So we need to look at this from a different lens, from a different perspective. So for me, I've never shared these images. This is the first time I went to Costa Chica in 2003. Father Glenn gave me the silent treatment, as they say. He had me a whole day just waiting for me to really interview him. I was in Costa Chica in 2003 doing a summer abroad study program where I was learning about ethnic diversity in Oaxaca. And there was one day in that entire month of discussions and lectures that they talked about the Black presence in Oaxaca. You know, having Black ancestry myself from the state of Michoacan, and like many Mexicans in the diaspora or Mexican living in Mexico today, I was always questioned whether I was Mexican or not. I was always questioned whether my features were Cuban, Dominican, like many of you, you know, if you're listening. I experienced the same type of discrimination, racism at times, but I didn't know. I was too young. And something about la Mexicanidad and growing up as a Mexican, as Mexicano, you are asleep. And no wonder why the national project of Mexicanidad became so successful, right? We don't question race. Race is not to be talked about. But when I arrived to Costa Chica and I met Father Glenn, and this is in large due because of my mentor also, Dr. Esteban, another anthropologist at UC Davis, who was at the time the chair of the Native American Studies. I had taken the course already, but I went on an honor thesis, you know, field trip, you know, with him, study abroad. And I used this as an opportunity to really hit the archives, hit the local libraries, because I wasn't finding much on Afro-Mexico in 2003 at the libraries. You know, YouTube and Facebook, the way we see it today, was not what it was back then. So I needed to go to the source. I knew that. So Father Glenn was an inspiration and a key source for me to understand and unpack Blackness. And these are pictures when we were opening up the third library in Costa Chica near his town El Ciruelo. And I helped him that morning put books in the truck. And then we drove that truck. And of course, I'm talking to him the whole time about why the third library, how did this all get started. I was doing a film documentary. Essentially, these pictures were very limited because I had in one hand I had my film camera, and in my left hand I had Father Glenn's camera. So I know Father Glenn would always be filming moments like this. So these pictures were the only ones. I have a few more others that I took of that trip. But it was a beautiful experience to see kids learn about, you know, Black history. And the whole vision of the Third Root Library, as I will talk later on, was to expose kids to, you know, African diaspora history. And Father Glenn was trying to bring books to Costa Chica, you know, at the time. And he has a beautiful story, but I'm going to stop there for now and continue with, after coming back from that trip, you know, actually, after going from Costa Chica back to Oaxaca to the hostel, I received a phone call, and this was Makeda, and I knew Makeda through 91X as a radio host, and I was honored to and appalled just the fact that she had called the hostel. How did she find me, right? She had communicated that she also had a vision of creating a maroon museum, one that really spoke to the African presence in Mexico. So here I am with Makeda. After coming from Costa Chica, I would meet with her, and in 2000, this was 2004 when I met her. So later we kept that relationship, and in 2009, I spent a whole year with Makeda volunteering at the Worldbeat Center, helping her with Worldbeat live productions, TV shows, helping her out with radio, and really trying to really you know, understand the multiple dimensions in which the Worldbeat Center operates. It was beautiful, and I was under her mentorship at the time, and we knew that the African Presence in Mexico exhibit was coming, and we were both excited about it. We had just kind of, you know, started the Afro-Mexican department, so this was part of our research. It was a beautiful exhibit put together by the Chicago Mexican American Museum, if I'm not mistaken, where we interviewed Cesar Moreno, the co-curator, and we got to really see the exhibit, which eventually turned into a book. If you haven't come across that book, do yourself a favor and try to look for that book. It's a great source. I used it in my master thesis, and it compiled a lot of important information. But But you know what? The vision since then has been to really bridge the African diaspora and the Americas, because there's a powerful story to be told. And the Worldbeat Center was, for me, the home of Africa and indigenous history. And I couldn't have found a better place to really arrived, because it already had a lot built, for the young generation like myself and others. And, learning video, learning radio allowed me to understand the importance of multimedia. And hence what we're doing right now, it's very important, right? To record history, to record a moment in time. So while coming back from my research, I eventually was very curious to know about the Afro-Mexican diaspora in the United States, and also was trying to keep in touch with what was going on in Mexico at the time. I found AfricaAC, which is a nonprofit in Costa Chica's website, a blogspot, a multi images. I forget the name of the website at the time, which has been discontinued. But it would be my newspaper, right, of Afro-Mexican relations at the time. And I came across this image of this Afro-Mexican queen pageant, and which was for me the first time I'd ever seen a Mexican government document that had the Black presence in the front cover. This is the first time I see something like this. And then I would come to know that there's Black presence in Pasadena, California, and also in Santana, California, and which really much connects to these communities in Costa Chica. So I knew that I was going to be able to answer a lot of the curiosity questions about my own past. Being an Afro descendant myself from my father's side, from Michoacan, and then from my mom's side, I get the Yaqui, Purepecha, y Mexicano. I think the diversity of Mexico is really rich, as I'm about to show. But more importantly, this moment for me allowed me to have a window into what could be my own identity, because at the time it was unimaginable, it was invisible. I did not know that or had any idea that Mexico had any connection with Africa or had any African presence. And by then I was in my, I was 19, 20 years old, and I'm sure there's many people out there. They're in their 50s. They might have died and might not even know that this was their own history. I would go back to Costa Chica in 2010. These are pictures that I took. I would spend a whole month with Israel and Angustias, who hosted me without any cost, without anything. And I went there because I wanted to learn more about them, get to know them, but also because they have a library. See, Father Glenn had his own library, and then the Angustias and Israel had their own library, right? And they had a computer shop, and it was a cultural center, essentially. It was a mini version, I guess, of what the Worldbeat Center is, right? So I was very familiar with it. I was asking for Father Glenn at the time. I knew he wasn't living in El Ciruelo, that he had moved to this town called Guasototitlan, which is named after the municipality there. So I went to go visit him. He was very surprised to see me almost 10 years later. He said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" I'm going to give mass on Sunday. You should come with me. So of course I wanted to, at the time I was completing my master thesis, and I was eager to just, break bread with him, check up on him, see how he was doing, and also come full circle to my promise. My promise to him was that I wouldn't just publish a scholarly paper. I wouldn't just do presentations based on my research. I wouldn't just go for my PhD just to prove myself, but I would be an advocate for Afro-Mexican rights, that I would come back to the United States to really tell the story, because it's important for people to know. And, this was in a way to tell them, I continue following the same line of thought of where we left. And what was beautiful when I spent time with him at his home, he studied liberation theology, Father Glenn, and I have to say that one of the most impressive things that he said to me when I first met him was, "Can you believe?" Because he was ordained to Guadalajara, Jalisco, as a priest. He had a beautiful church. He could have just left everything, right, and just be comfortable and be comfortable in Jalisco. He gave that up the moment he knew there was Black people in Mexico. He left, he unpacked, he packed his bags, and in 1982, 83, he arrives to Costa Chica. And he never left since then. I think most recently he went back to Trinidad, where he's from. But through that liberation theology that he brought and Black Marxist theory, he really began to understand the complexity of internalizing Blackness. And one of the things that he really was surprised was the first time he was trying to give mass on a Sunday in a Black community in Mexico, nobody showed up. Nobody would go to his masses because he was Black and nobody could take him serious. These are Black Mexicans in Mexico who wouldn't go to church or a Sunday mass because he was Black. That really impacted him. He told me it was a struggle to really figure out what he was going to do. So he started to give mass in people's homes. He went to them, and some families became very fond of him. He's just a great human being. I'm blessed that he's come in my pathway in the time that I've studied this topic. So while I was with Israel, I was really understanding the cultural diversity, the inter-ethnic relationships that exist in Costa Chica, which were very rich, and how they, as promoters of culture, have really bring a lot of visibility to the movement. Henry Louis Gates from Black in Latin America, he stopped by his house. He interviewed Father Glenn. Henry Louis Gates says one of the most inspiring moments in Costa Chica was meeting Father Glenn. And I would have to say that happened to me the same way. One of the first things Father Glenn told me when I arrived, he said, "You don't have to worry anymore, Jorge. Ya llegaste con tu gente. You have arrived, Jorge. You have arrived with your Black people, essentially." Because for the first time, the phenotypes of people that I would see looked very much like mine. And I felt like I had been negated, right? This history that was very important to me. So I'm going to go, of course, to unpack colonial history, it would take us days. But considering the time, I really want to cover this part because we need to understand diversity in the Americas, right? Or Turtle Island, as natives will call it, or Africa. There was a rich diversity, and people were migrating up and down off of the coast. There's documentation of all of this today. The diversity was rich in the Americas, and we cannot continue this conversation without keeping that in mind. And one of the historians, that I allude to a lot is Runoko Rashidi, who also is part of the Worldbeat Cultural Center and has talked extensively about the diaspora of Africans prior to Columbus arriving to the Americas, and Jack Forbes too, who had a lot of historical primary sources that documented Africans arriving to the Americas and Native Americans arriving to Europe before Columbus arrived. So one thing to keep in mind is that by the 14th century in Ghana and Mali, the Muslim world was pretty strong, and they were pretty dominant in trade. And keep in mind, the Moors had dominated southern Spain prior to Columbus arriving and Cortés arriving to the Americas. So Sevilla and southern Spain was rich in African presence. These are some of the books that I highly recommend. If you haven't done your research or are curious, go ahead, buy them on Amazon. And one thing that I learned as I was doing my master thesis, these books can be very expensive, some of them $100. So there's privilege in knowledge. And I was privileged, and I'm still in debt, right, with the academia, that I was able to really tap into some of the best books around the world, that I was able to order them from Holland, from Germany, things that were hard to get. And I was able to read Aguirre Beltrán's book, La Población de México y Cuijla. And a lot of these books allowed me to understand the rich history that existed between indigenous and Africans since the beginnings, right? We know with Aguirre Beltrán's book that in Mexico, around 200,000 and 250,000 Africans had arrived. And keep in mind that by then, little kids and sometimes women were not even counted as a full slave. So the numbers could be way off completely. We also began to see the rise of confraternities. And the beautiful thing that at the time that there was still this connection with Africa up until the mid 17th century. You still have love letters, as they would call them, of people sending letters back, to Africa because they still were connected. The umbilical cord of Africa was still there. So that is very important, rich history, and a lot of the documentation that comes out of this period comes from ecclesiastical documentation that eventually Aguirre Beltran became a pioneer in using these documents that had just been collecting dust for many, many years. But there's all these other great historical books out there that talk about the Olmec presence and migrations of Africans to the Americas. And there's just so much to unpack there that we can't spend enough time. But what I do want to say is we need to look into Maroon history. We often talk about slavery history, but when we talk about the agency of Africans who were arriving as agents of change, as free men into the Americas, as explorers at times, that there was also Yanga, when he arrived into Veracruz, freeing the first free community, as we know, in San Lorenzo. There was other Maroon communities that were uprising throughout Mexico. There's documentation of these, communities or confraternities that were mobilizing and organizing themselves, mainly a lot of the times to bury people, bury their own brothers and sisters. So they were collecting dues amongst each other, como cundinas in Espanol, to be able to pay for someone's funeral. And through these, and of course they were sheltered and they were hosted inside churches. Between 1596 and 1666, there was confraternities in Veracruz, Zacatecas, Guadalajara, Michoacán, Colima, San Luis Potosí, Michoacán, Guanajuato, Sinaloa, Ensenada. And a lot of these big cities had to do with the minery business. There was a lot of mining, and mining was a huge, big business in the Americas. And keep in mind that at the beginning of the 16th century, Fray Bartolomé de las Casas said, the indigenous communities have souls. They shouldn't be slaves. So that also created a new wave of Africans that would eventually arrive to the Americas because Africans apparently didn't have souls. And that was really impactful to hear and to know because who was he? Like, what kind of spiritual man would say something like that of another human being? Later on, he felt like he was wrong and he was incorrect about that. He really was trying to make peace with that, but it was too late by then. Juan Garrido, for those of you who don't know, his presence had been in Mexico since the beginnings. These codices and that exist today talk about Juan Garrido of Congolese origin, who was also a colonizer to some degree, an explorer known for bringing wheat to the Americas for the first time. And as we move down the historical timeline, because Juan Garrido was not the only one. There was many other explorers of African descent coming around with him. Some of them were under the command of colonial Spanish rule, and others came on their own. We've seen that throughout the Americas of Africans arriving with their own people and not as slaves. So let's keep in mind that in this conversation that there's the Black Afro-Mexican community has always had agency. And this story that we've been bought and sold into to some degree is false. And we need to really check our historical documents, right? Because it is true, there was a lot of pain. And there is a lot of historical generational trauma that has occurred as a result of that. And Yanga and his son, who were liberators of these communities, it was not only African, and I always like to tell this story because it was both Black and indigenous. And African and indigenous relationships, like I showed in my first slides, have been in the making of this since the beginning, and that is the case today in Costa Chica. Cannot separate one without the other, right? These are interethnic relationships and intermarriages that have happened since the beginnings of Mexico, right? So to say that we have a pure race of indigenous, or to say there is a pure race of mestizos, or a pure race of Europeans is bogus. So between 1519 and 1750, we would see, a huge migration of Africans coming from Africa to Mexico, and largely having to do with the type of work that they were doing. Some of them were casta de nación, which were more of the privileged category, and casta de raza, based on their skill set. So keep in mind, a lot of Africans and brothers and sisters that were coming from Seville, some of them had skills. They were musicians. They were they knew how to do work with wood. They were muleteers. They were geologists, scientists, you name it. A lot of the judicial records out there and manumissions, documentations that are from the times when they were seeking their freedom or trying to buy their freedom. They would tell stories of how they would contribute to society, right? Or how they did them bad in the process, and they would get, really, they were not really respected the way they wanted. So a lot of the documentation that's out there has to do with, folks really trying to move in this new social mobility of being Black and African, of African descent in Mexico. And within that rubric of what become the Mexicanidad between the indigenous Black, there was a lot of hues of Blackness. And not only to add the 100,000 Filipinos that came through the port of Acapulco. That adds a whole different entire mix to the picture. So right here we see the Costa paintings, which were very, and I'm going to continue showing some of these, significant, I think historically, because it's a depiction of what people saw back then. And this was the representation that happened early on. But again, by this time, by the late 1750s, we were close to 500,000 Africans that had arrived to Mexico at the time, mainly through the port of Veracruz and through the port of Acapulco. This is a story I recently came across that I didn't know much about. Estebanico, the African explorer of Moor descent from Morocco in the 1500s. He was traveling all over the Americas, all over the United States, apparently, and through Mexico. He eventually died in Mexico, but he had built relationships with the Zuni people, the indigenous people. There is recordings, historical recordings of him carrying a baton with a guard with owl feathers, something very symbolic of the Zuni people and death, right? So again, this just goes to say of the history that we need to continue learning. This expedition of the ANSA expedition, this was a time where a lot of Africans, there was around 200 that originally left Mexico to protect northern frontiers in California. The composition here was indigenous, European, of course. 30% of the members in the historical expedition of the ANSA were Afro-Latinos. And this is all, again, recorded through historical documentation. And some of these explorers would become Pio Pico. He was in that same, Pio Pico's grandparents would come here and would eventually establish what we now know as Los Angeles, right? And other big important communities in Norte California. So this is, again, a census breakdown, which is to me very inaccurate, but again gives us an idea of the Black presence already in these communities, of indigenous presence and European. And there's some other records that show there was 20 to 1. For every 20 Africans, there was one European, and that was the case for a long time, up until like post the colonial period. The independence movement was, honestly, one of the eras that I'm most fascinated by, and I'm very moved by Vicente Guerrero and the work that Jose Maria Morales created. But essentially, for me, in reading this book by The Legacy of Vicente Guerrero, Mexico's first Black Indian president, it really gave me a window of what was happening then. I highly recommend that book. And it's another one that's really expensive, but if you find the digital format, go ahead. But I'll tell you what interested me about this book, that Vicente Guerrero was of African indigenous background. He married a Filipina woman. He abolished slavery, as some of you already know. But what's interesting, he was a muleteer. He knew geology. He knew soil. He was able to support and support his own army by finding diamonds in the mountains and buying weaponry from Veracruz, because he knew the paths, he knew the roads. And a lot of it had to do with his relationship with the indigenous community, the Anahuac people, the Musgos, a lot of the people that were the original people of this land. He comes from this town of Tixla, which was like the crossroads of a lot of these communities. Jose Maria Morelos was eventually gave him the baton to launch and continue the movement for independence. It's really a rich history. We cannot cover all of it today. But what's important is that both of these men were Black. They were Afro-Indigenous. They were Afro-Mexican. And, at the time, knowing that, Vicente Guerrero was abolishing slavery before the United States did, and the movement that eventually would inspire the abolishment of slavery from Abraham Lincoln and the entire movement of slaves that were uprising in their own maroon communities for freedom. And again, part of the problematic with Mexican history is the widening of Afro-Mexican leaders, right? This speaks for itself. This is the story that I consumed as a kid. I didn't know, first and foremost, is hardly ever talked about Vicente Guerrero in his presence. You don't really see his kinky hair. His complexity has gotten more white over the years. Same can be said about Jose Maria Morelos. And these are two important Mexican heroes who are of Black descent, who fought for both African indigenous history. But what's really important to mention, they were not saying Viva Mexico. They were saying Viva America. They were the Simón Bolívar of North America. I know we can't compare them, but to some degree, that was the magnitude and the type of heroes that they were at the time. They had a big vision. They had a big vision for the Americas to liberate Black and indigenous people. So what got construed eventually about Mexico came later on. This is a great picture of a Black brother, of an Afro-Mexican brother in Guanajuato. Again, another important city where minery was big. Keep in mind, mining and cattle industry was heavily conducted and was done by a lot of African labor. Not to say that eventually the intermarriages and the intermixtures and the social mobility of classes would broaden and the mestizo population would become pretty dominant. But this book, again, Theodore G. Vincent, I can't stress it enough. It's one that you should look up and take a read. The last one, Theodore W. Cohen, another great book to really understand this era, 19th century, the making of Mexico, which for me really unpacks the role of Blackness and Black heroes and the movements of independence. And that's the same case in Colombia, in Peru. There's always stories that it was, the indigenous population and the mestizo population who led us to freedom. But it was truly also a movement of Afro-Mexicans and Afro-Indigenous brothers and sisters that had been united since the beginning, who understood the roads, who understood geography, who had been soldiers since the 16th century, who had a history of being in the front lines. So important to note here is, if we look at the abolishment of slavery that started in Argentina, Argentina had one of the biggest African slave populations. Today is one of the smallest. But that just goes to say the history that needs to be uncovered. And really, I know there's a movement in Afro-Argentina today. There's a lot to unpack there. Hopefully one day we'll see more of that. But that became a movement, right? We had Muslim uprisings in Bahia since the 16th century, right? Who knew how to read and write, Africans who were seeking their liberation. And this continued on, right? This history, oral tradition didn't get lost. Eventually, it would reach to Mexico. Like I said, Vicente Guerrero and Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo, Jose Maria Morelos, really led this expedition to liberate Mexico, which at the time was just the Americas, Norte America. And then in 1865, we have the slavery abolishment in the U.S. as a result of the end of Civil War. And of course, Juneteenth that gets celebrated at the Worldbeat Center and gets celebrated in San Diego and across the country in the United States. For those of you who are listening in Mexico, it's a big day for Afro-American history, and in Afro-American history and Afro-Mexican history is just one history. I cannot go without this presentation talking about the intermarriages and intermixing of indigenous and African descent people that happen in North America with the Moskogos and, of course, the Seminole people that eventually would flee to Florida to seek their own freedom. There, eventually, they would come across other indigenous groups that were also refugees. And so the Maroon communities blended in with the Seminole communities there. And I'm hoping Patricia and Donahi can tell us more, because one of the Encounter Black villages took place in this community in Coahuila. But this map is really impactful. It really opened up my eyes on how much history I need to continue learning. The history of John Horse is quite amazing, knowing that he led a whole movement to go from Mexico, which at the time was Texas and Coahuila were one state, and they were trying to, move south to seeking for freedom. So the path, the railroad, the Underground Railroad that we often hear about didn't go up only north, but it also went south. And I would contribute John Horse as being one of the leaders that sent that expedition and brought our African brothers and sisters down from North America into Mexico, of what we now know as eventually Coahuila. And this eventually would launch a whole movement of the Civil War in the United States, the Civil War that happened in Texas, and all having to do with what we're seeing a lot today: white supremacists, British descendants who think slavery shouldn't have ended. And they were very much anchored in Texas, and Texas became the state of contention. And eventually the lines were drawn, right? The annexation of Mexico would happen, and of that part of Mexico would happen. And keep in mind, Vicente Guerrero and previous Afro-Mexican leaders were vital in protecting northern frontiers from British rule. And again, this was free land, right? This was an area where government was still in the making, 1820s, 1830s, and heroes like John Horse, who led an expedition down south, seeking the path to freedom, just like we now know of the path north, was very important, and people should know that. Again, one of the families that benefited from that early onset expedition was the Pio Pico family. Pio Pico de Jesus was the last governor of Alta California before the annexation of southern Mexico. And if you look up the history of Los Angeles, California, a lot of the founders of this big city were of African descent, and a lot of them came from Mexico at the time. This was the man responsible for bringing a lot of the European presence and for creating manifest destiny in what we now know as Mexico. He believed in the progress of the race, el progreso de la raza, that we, and to be white, to become more light in skin was a solution to the race. And he was a very strong believer of social Darwinism and colonial stratification. So he still wanted to go back to the way things were before. He began the railroad movement in Mexico, the goods movement in Mexico. He began to displace people, the Mayas. He would send them north. He would do anything with any people. This is a man who I think could be compared with Trump today. And he's someone I don't really like to talk too much about, but it's important for people to know that although we had a lot of heroes, there was also the villains, as a lot of stories would trace. But what's important, that this idea of whitening of a population really started with him. And we could also go way further back, but he was one of the architects of this. We all know Emiliano Zapata, and a lot of people get, and in my experience, in the time that I've been learning a lot about Black presence in communities where Zapata grew up, in Morelos, in Valle de Cautla or in Michoacán. A lot of Mexicans today have issues to say that, Zapata might have had African ancestry, or Jose Maria Morelos to have African ancestry, or Vicente Guerrero to have African ancestry. I'm not gonna, I think the presentation speaks for itself. These communities, like the one that, Zapata comes from, had 101 families of Afro-Mexican origin. 32 of them were indigenous families. None of them were mestizos. A lot of them, these were records that would either be documented through the local church, the Catholic Church. They would document a lot of the families. So these are historical documents that exist in most communities. So it's important to know your history. I really like how we see Afro-Mexican revolutionaries, and there was documentation of that. I'm sure there's more images out there. But know that Zapata was mainly supported by a lot of the Afro-Mexican army that had been built since Vicente Guerrero. And there was generation after generation of families that were part of the struggle for liberation. This is a very important period for me that I'm going to stress, that for me in doing and understanding Afro-Mexican studies, we cannot go without saying that the construction of La Mexicanidad, the construction and erasure of Blackness was really a project, and it really became very successful. Maybe there was a 1% chance it wouldn't be successful, but for the most part, it was successful up until this moment. Now I'm going to read a little bit from the thesis that I wrote. In 1951, anthropologist Gonzalo Aguirre Beltrán published the first ethnographical publication titled Cuijla, Esbozo Etnográfico de un Pueblo Negro, a black village of Coaxi in the state of Guerrero. He detailed studies would help trace, synthesize, contemporize African legacy in Mexico by bringing the surface of unprecedented numbers of origins of important African ethnic groups. According to scholarly consensus, back then, Mexican anthropology was consolidating the nation using ethnic groups as a model of study to understanding politics of difference based on his findings. Aguirre Beltrán, since 1946, had already been a director of the INI, National Indigenous Institute, declared that Afro-Mestizos could not be differentiated as a collective ethnic group, and as a result, they were not rendered into national legislation. Aguirre Beltrán's work romanticized, essentialized, minimized, and generalized the Afro-Mexican identity. Indeed, because he went as far as to say that Afro-Mestizos, or Afro-Mexicans, cannot be differentiated as an ethnic group. These assertions would eventually be rendered into nation-state legislations. Specifically, Aguirre Beltrán made these assertions after becoming director of National Indigenous Institute. All this to say that Aguirre Beltrán would eventually saw the Afro-Mestizos as a great model of study to find how integrationist theory essentially would apply in Mexico. And by that I mean how Afro-Mestizos were already mixed enough that they would eventually become part of the major society. So he felt like in the next 30, 40 years, the Black community in Costa Chica and Black communities throughout Mexico would eventually disappear and be part of the mestizaje, the rich mestizaje that was a project then. That is very, for me, it was very hard and difficult to understand and unpack that because that really systematized, again, the erasure of Blackness in the historical landscape and the ethno-racial landscape of Mexico in anthropological studies. Although he contributed a lot to the sciences of anthropology and historical documentation of the Black population, he at the same time was erasing them by saying that they would eventually blend into the communities. And because of the road that got constructed in Costa Chica in the 1960s, Black communities like Costa Chica would eventually erase. Of course, his background, we always have to trace where they studied, who they studied under, but he was very much into the integrationist theory, just like Afro-Americans have looked into how the South went into big cities like Chicago, Atlanta. These were projects that were really fueled and economically sponsored by the state to form a nation state. So there was money behind this to have theorists like José Vasconcelos, Manuel Gamio, Presidente Obregón, Presidente Lázaro Cárdenas, that put in a lot of money, invested a lot of money in the making of a mestizaje, or a romanticized mestizaje that did not include Blackness, did not include African history. Hence why a lot of Chicanos or even a lot of Mexican Americans have pride in their indigenous and European ancestry. And never is it mentioned that, there's also African presence, right? Hopefully this presentation changes that discourse here today. For those of you who are listening, you talk to your family members, you talk to your tias, you talk to your friends, and you share this information because it's very vital and important to know that the construct of Mexican as we know today was really a package, tailored manufacturing of purity of race, and essentially an economic development project to bring the rural communities into Mexico. Aguirre Beltrán's work to this day is incredible because he did a lot of great documentation. I cannot discredit that. He gave me a first glance at his work at these communities, San Nicolás, Coaxi, which Coahuiniculapa is a town that was a maroon community in its times, right? And he really did a good job figuring out what were the ethnic racial markers that differentiated these communities from indigenous communities. However, like I said before, according to him and based on the ethnic markers that were used, they wouldn't have the ethnic parameters to measure if they were ethnic or not. So because as a result of that, they weren't considered or were even thought of possibly being an ethnic group at the time. This became very problematic, I think, in Afro-Mexican studies. Eventually, this is the image, Reina America Queen. It's an image that gets used in Costa Chica today. And again, this is Afro-Mexicans. This is the images that they were consuming, right, in the making of La Mexicanidad. This romanticized, Europeanized version of indigenous and European history. And then we began seeing social media, telenovelas and the El Siglo de Oro and TV, and really, again, erasing African history, demoralizing history, putting negative connotations behind being Black, from the novela Marimar to Carrusel de Niños. These are soap operas that I grew up in. I grew up watching these soap operas. I consumed the same poison, which is racism, internal racism, that has been fed to a lot of Mexicanos. Yes, we can give credit to the cinema, a moment in history and how pivotal that was to cinema in the world. But these were very intentional moments of ignorance, but also structural racism that really construed and began to erase Blackness and give a negative connotation to being Black in Mexico. I'm gonna stop around here, but I really wanna point to these historical moments that, there was international movements happening around the world that would inspire the Black movement in Costa Chica and Oaxaca and then Guerrero and Mexico City to launch a third group program, to launch programming sponsored by the United Nations and then the Mexican government, sometimes for their own party benefits, sometimes because historians like Aguirre Beltran, Luz Maria Martinez would also be, some of the Mexican scholars would be very fond and wanted to put historical documentation and change that narrative of Mexico. Again, they were carving a new pathway and telling a new story, the story of the fandangos and son jarocho in Veracruz, the story of the Black presence in Colima, the story of Black presence in Guanajuato, and a lot of historical documentations began coming out of the 1990s, early 2000s. In fact, it would inspire eventually Father Glenn to use one of the exhibits that was put together by Tony Bleetons in 1993 to use that as a flyer for the first encounter of Black villages done and created in 1997 in Costa Chica. This would become the first event where the community would come together to talk about collective Black identity and the issues that they were confronting. And I'm going to leave that eventually to Donahi and Patricia in a minute. I'm gonna take us on, and I know all of you, if you're looking at this quickly, you're gonna be able to rewind later on and see this historical timeline later on. But this 2011 became important. This was around the time that I was completing my master thesis. I felt like the work that a lot of the folks in Costa Chica who were on the front lines was beginning to get traction, was getting visibility. Mexico and Oaxaca was implementing and changing constitutional rights for the Black communities. Although it was sort of tucked in under indigenous rights, we have to say that the Afro-Mexican Black agenda was moving forward with recognition. There was a lot of movements on behalf of the government, but again, a lot of them a lot of the early groundwork started with Mexico Negro in Africa, and later on the Red, the organizaciones, and other organizations that now throughout the country in Mexico that have been forming, youth Afro-Mexican groups are forming and are taking lead and finding their place and time to be a part of this narrative, which is essentially beautiful. Costa Chica has a rich diversity, like I've said, and I know we're gonna have Donahi from this community and speak to us about its rich diversity. Again, the terrain there really prevented Europeans from coming or wanting to live in this community, since it was a very hot land. These are very tropical lands. When I was there, it's pretty hot and humid. Not many people can bear that. And to get to these communities up until the 60s, you needed to go by horse or by plane or helicopter. It was pretty rural. It was very hard to get, dirt roads to get there. So up until the 1960s, these communities were able to get more access. And I think that contributed to the strong Black communities that you see there today. And tomorrow we're going to have Israel Reyes Larrea giving really a talk about how he started the first Afro-Mexican radio in Costa Chica, how he began organizing the first dance and music festivals in Costa Chica in the 90s, and how that would inspire visibility movements throughout the country. And, you know, people like Henry Louis Gates would eventually find out about him because of what he was putting out there. And mind you that at the time, back in early 2000s, it was hard to put information on websites, hard to get access to the internet and all that. So, you know, the organizers since the 90s began organizing and mobilizing. And by 2007, you know, the organizations took a really big step and saying, you know what, we need to count our people, even if we have to do it ourselves. And UNAM stepped in there, the university stepped in there, a lot of organizations participated, and they conducted the first census that would inspire eventually other government entities to be a part of. The Queen pageants became an interesting topic for me that I began to study. For me, this was the Black is Beautiful movement for the first time, and patriotic festivities. There wasn't just the indigenous and European Queen pageants, but then you would incorporate Black Afro-Mexican Queen pageants into the narrative. And a lot of it has to do with community leaders and organizations like Africa that were promoters of culture, and making sure that the Queen pageants were to take the stage, were to go hold that mic and really be a voice for their people. And that's very important, because these patriotic festivities are attended by large groups, and to be able to communicate to the masses what the Afro-Mexican movement is struggling and what they're about was huge. And this for me became a window into understanding the perplexities and complexities of being Black in Mexico today. I'm going to pass this now on to Patricia. This is some statistics that are very important to keep in mind. You know, this is one of the first inter-census that happened in Mexico, 2015. And as you all heard earlier, 2020 was the first time we see this in Mexico. This is some of the census statistics. Guerrero and Oaxaca, Veracruz, and Mexico City have one of the biggest populations. And I don't think we'll have a more accurate census headcount since this one, considering COVID and the impact it had with the census today in 2020. And this is the timeline, and thanks, Donahi. This is a beautiful documentation that you were able to create. Así que muchas gracias, Donahi, por haber creado este documento tan importante en Wikipedia. Thank you, Donahi, for creating this. This is just an exhibit of the artwork that has gone and all the work that goes behind this. It's unimaginable, and I wouldn't be able to speak on this, and hence why today, you know, I want to pass the mic to Patricia and Donahi to really take us into the now situation, what's happening in Costa Chica today. What are the goals and objectives? What have been some of the struggles of the movement you all started? And I know Donahi has been a founder of the Afro-Mexican movement in Costa Chica. And Patricia, you serving with the Dr. MLK, Dr. Martin Luther King Task Force in Michigan, and now living in Mexico and serving as a member of Mexico Negro, and being a bridge between two countries, but one people. I'm sure you will be able to provide a lot of insight, and I'm really glad you're here today with us. Thank you for bearing everybody with us today. For those of you who are tuning in, know that this is being recorded, and we will be able to share this with you later on. Patricia, I'm going to pass it on now to you. Thanks again. And we'll come back at the end to share a slide of next steps and how people can continue engage in this topic, and to talk a little bit more about our talk that we're giving tomorrow, as well as a discussion that's going to follow this conversation today. So if you're seeing us through YouTube or Facebook, go to the chat comment section, and there's going to be a link that you can sign up to now, where we're going to have a conversation about this presentation and the presentation Donahi is about to give us, and Patricia now. Thanks again. I'm here. It's all yours, Patricia.
Muchas gracias, Jorge. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I have my sister and my comadre, Donna Jimenez Taylor, on the line. We're multitasking, and she is also giving classes at the same time.
Wow.
Okay. But I want to take you very briefly through a project that we did called Pathways to Freedom in the Americas. This was a collaborative effort with Donna Jimenez Taylor, who is one of the founders of Mexico Negro. I call her the Harriet Tubman of Mexico. My work, my master's thesis, I come out of the University of Michigan, and I was studying how to develop systems of sustainable economic development, which I could not do in the United States because of the systemic racism. So I came to Mexico to study. And with Dr. Talia Weltman Cisneros, who's out of Southern Methodist University, who is also a naturalized Mexican citizen. I tease the two of them. Talia is from South Africa, who knows apartheid in South Africa. She is a naturalized Mexican citizen, married to a Mexican national. Donahue is Afro-Mexican, and I always tell him I'm the one in the middle because I've been Black on both sides of the border. Our president is Profesora, I call him my Sergio, from Mexico Negro Asociación Civil. Again, this is a state incorporated organization. So what Jorge was talking about was on the other side in Oaxaca. We're in the state of Guerrero. Our objectives: to eliminate the invisibility of Afro descendants in Mexico. And that comes through constitutional recognition, political, social, and economic development. I come in on the economic development side. To rescue and promote and disseminate Afro-Mexican cultural traditions, and to fight against all forms of racism. This project that I'm showing you comes from a collaboration between Mexico Negro Asociación Civil and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Task Force of Southfield, Michigan. I'm originally, that's my hometown in the United States. I have lived in Mexico for 23 years. I'm a nationalized citizen. So again, I function on both sides of the border. This project was a 2-year research project. Donahue and I met each other, both of us are masters in our field. We knew nothing about each other, and we shared this research. The research has been displayed at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, Michigan. We've had over 30,000 visitors on our website and through various businesses throughout the state of Michigan, and has never been exhibited in Mexico, which is a project for us. And as Jorge mentioned, this is the decade of tribute to descendants of Africa from the United Nations. I want to take you through a little bit of the history about this constitutional recognition. Again, dating back to the ancient times of the Olmec having been present in Mexico. Jorge talked about the Atlantic slave trade. There were more Africans that came into Latin America. Mexico is part of North America, so I'm including for this moment Mexico and South America. There were more Africans that came into these countries, these continents, than into the United States. But what people often don't know about is the other route, the Trans-Pacific route. The Spanish went to Africa, went around the Cape Hope in South America, over to the Philippines, which was then called China, and then back to the Pacific coast. That is why hair like mine, pelo chino, the exact translation is Chinese hair, is because the first Africans that were seen on the Pacific coast came off the boats from China. The other influx of Africans into Mexico came from what Jorge talked about, the Underground Railroad to the south. Just think about it. We talk about the pathway to freedom from, in my state, Michigan, we were able to go right across the river to Canada. But think about it. If there was only a river, the Rio Grande, in between slavery and freedom, then African Americans crossed that river to freedom during the Underground Railroad. But those stories are told in Spanish. And incidentally, there's a movement today of African Americans coming across the border. This goes back to the caste system that Jorge was talking about, where the race classification came in with all these different mixtures. The Spanish church allowed interracial marriages. I call it the concept of the black womb. If a black man married an indigenous woman, then that offspring would be free. If he married an enslaved black woman, his child would be enslaved. So once again, the black woman is relegated to the bottom of the totem pole. But again, look at the various classifications of, quote, the mixture of marriages. Here's this same photo that Jorge had, again, about the classification of races. This graph, which you also had, Jorge, was one that I did off of my computer and posted on all the websites. I read Beltran's book, and as he talked about the mixture of races. Now let's compare this to the laws in the United States that Plessy Ferguson, 1896, U.S. Supreme Court. If you have one drop of black blood, you are considered black. Blacks did not go away. They intermingled. So if you apply the same categorization and legalization as in the United States, most would be black. And that's why when everybody sees my kinky hair, they all talk about their black grandma, their black auntie, there's somebody in their family. A recent publication that just came out by the Senate of Mexico talks about almost 30 different regional names for these different groups of Afrodescendientes. In the United States, this is hard for us because we were in an apartheid state. Race was legalized. You are Patricia the Negra. Okay. Everything was classified as black. But if you have been calling yourself by your native names, by your customary names, then you have not been taught that you were, quote, black. And on the birth certificates in Mexico, or any document in Mexico, does not include race. I can't go to a dentist's office in the United States and not check off the racial form. In fact, that's something I do that's very funny because I always check off other, human. Okay, and then they have to scratch it off and put me down as black. But nothing in Mexico identifies anybody as by race. And this is a legacy of Vicente Guerrero, the second president of Mexico, who was of African descendant. He was African descendant. He abolished slavery during his administration. And to Jorge's point, I have a little picture on the side here of how he's been portrayed in history books. He was white and bright. This was, as Donahue says, her motivation when she was in elementary school or high school and studied this. And she said, oh no, he was of African descent. Donahue has been working, I became a naturalized Mexican citizen in 2018. So as of that point, I was able to participate in political, social, and economic development opportunities as a citizen of Mexico. Donahue, Sergio, everybody has been working for this cause for over 25 years. And we had a pre-census survey in 2015, and the question was asked for the first time. Are you or your descendants, do you consider yourself to be Black, Afro-Mexican, or an African descendant? Now remember, historically, this classification was discriminatory, so people didn't want to even talk about that. And they didn't know to call themselves as one group. So the history of education that went behind trying to get everybody to answer that question in the same way. Out of this survey came a map of where African Mexicans are today. And you'll see the great concentrations in the central part of Guerrero and Oaxaca. Jorge showed this graph too. We have almost 1.4 million people. The majority of those populations are in Guerrero, the state of Guerrero, and the state of Oaxaca. And this is called the Costa Chica area. Okay? But the survey also pointed out the disparities in economic conditions. The communities lacked health, lacked infrastructure, like schools, like roads. Before this survey, Afro-Mexicans were counted, but they were counted as part of the indigenous population. We have 68 official indigenous languages that are recognized in Mexico, and government allocations went out according to those groups. So without a classification, there was not a way to receive these government funds. And that's why this is inclusion, not exclusion. Now, I want you to be in touch for a moment with the people of La Costa Chica. So I'm going to take you to a short cruise, a tour of the people. Now, this was before the virus. This was back in 2011 when I went with Donahue on my first trip to the Costa Chica. First, let's talk about where we're get a geographic sense. We're talking about the middle of Mexico. You see Guerrero, the state of Guerrero, and the state of Oaxaca. Jorge did his work in the state of Oaxaca. I've done my work in the state of Guerrero. The state of Guerrero has 7 regions. They're like provinces or counties. The southernmost region is Costa Chica. The northernmost region of Oaxaca is also the Costa Chica zone. As Donahue taught me, just like in the United States, they built the highways through the Black communities. Well, Spaniards built the state lines through their communities. So they are all one, the Costa Chica region. My first stop was at the Museum of Vicente Guerrero in Coajinicuilapa, Guerrero. And this is where Donahue and her family lives. This is where my Professor Sergio lives, my Tocaya, Patricia Taylor, everybody lives in Costa Chica. And they have artifacts of some of the things that came off of the boats, of the slave ships. This is the library in Coajinicuilapa, and they have a replica of a slave ship with the hands of all the enslaved. I call them the enslaved because remember, these were doctors, these were lawyers, these were engineers, these were people of consciousness and intelligence. They were not slaves, they were enslaved. This is the center of Coajinicuilapa in Guerrero, the town center. And again, here are there are more horses than there are cars, and very handsome cowboys. That's another subject. I want you to see the people. And when I went through town, the family said, "Are you related?" And they told me this family name, and I said no, and they wanted me to come and see this family. Look at this child. Look at me. Is there any difference? Some of the culture, the Danza de los Diablos, that celebrated Day of the Dead, that's unique to the Costa Chica region. Can you say that you dance with the devil? I did. And by the way, picked up on the stand steps immediately, because I went to Tony School of Dance in Detroit, Michigan in 1958. And this is the integration, this is connection. It's tap dancing, there was the same steps, just give me the rhythm and I can boogie with you. We went to Adele Rodriguez in Coahuila to her art studio. Her paintings hang on the Senate of South Africa on their wall. And this is a depiction of freed Africans that came off the boats and landed in this area. Look at the art. And the food. And look at the hood. I stopped for a second. Look at the homes. This was before the virus. The last African hut that is in existence in this country. And I promised them, as you did, Jorge, that I would be back and I would do something to help restore that. And I saved the best for last. El Faro Bay, the landing spot of free Africans that touch the shores of my adopted country of Mexico. When Donahue took me there, I fell on my knees and I cried. In November 2020, we will hold the next meeting, Encuentro de los Negros 2020. It's going to be virtual this year because of the virus. Our objectives continue the constitutional recognition. Again, before the 2015, we were counted as part of the indigenous group, but resources were not allocated to the communities because we were not identified as a separate community. So now, given that we want to continue with this constitutional recognition, the challenge is the census. As Jorge mentioned, right when the census was starting in March, and then in the beginning of April is when Mexico, the delayed reaction from the United States, we got the virus. So I just saw people walking around 2 or 3 weeks ago with masks on, telling me they had never completed their assigned houses to get the census. And given what you saw before the virus, how does this impact the communities after? Now, we're going to do this whole event online. I wasn't even able to include this in this presentation because I am so honored to announce that May Peace Prevail on Earth International Foundation. I just talked to the executive director, Fumi Johns, yesterday, is going to donate their Zoom platform with 5,000 points of contact to Mexico Negros to use. Our challenge is, while the world may see it, our communities within those communities, they don't have internet, they don't have money to pay for cell phones, they don't have access to things. So those are the kinds of activities that we will be working on. I thank you, Jorge, for this opportunity, to all of you for this opportunity to talk about my adopted country of Mexico. Donna, he is around, and she does not speak English. I serve only as her voice. For my doctorate work, I came out of University of Michigan Ross Graduate School of Business. And my doctorate work is on developing sustainable economic systems. since those were developed in the United States under the construction of institutionalized racism. I'm hoping to work on this side of the border as they develop their economic agenda to work in a way that is sustainable and shareable with equitable return on investment for the local community. Power to the people. I thank you for this opportunity.
And let everybody see how beautiful you're there in Guerrero, rocking it. That's so incredible. It, you know, Patricia, it's so nice meeting you too. I fell in love. You know, Mexico is my adopted country too. You know, besides Peru. I mean, Africa was so far away, and the food and the plátano and the arroz and the frijoles is so close to, you know, our people, you know, what we eat.
Well, in fact, that's when I came to do my studies here in Mexico. That's exactly what my mama said. If I go to Africa, you're too far away. In Mexico, worst case, you can get on a bus and get back home. So for the first few years, I moved here 23 years ago. For the first few years, I kept a round trip bus ticket just in case I needed to get back home.
Absolutely. I mean, my mom, being in San Diego, it's like, you know, you grew up in Mexico, you partied in Mexico. And then I started going to, you know, Costa Rica and Panama, Brazil, and I started being in the favelas, started seeing Black people. When I was in Bahia, I cried when the plane was coming in from Rio to Bahia. I cried like you because all those African slaves that jumped into the ocean. You know, we just got a great history here, and this is where I grew up. And this side, I'm so proud of what you're doing, and you're rocking that. Need what you got on you.
Donna, everything I have, Donna, he bought for me. When we started this project together, her daughter was only 18 months old. So I said to her, she's a master in her field, I'm a master in mine. Teach me just like you would teach little Donna, he's Sophia. Make me understand just like you make her understand. So we never had a translator in between us. So everything, we have matching dresses, we interchanged homes. She went to stay with my mother and slept on the couch in Southfield, Michigan. I went to her family in Coajinicue-Lapa. And so total immersion. She has been my teacher, my guide. She calls me her sister, but I am a year older than her deceased mother. So I'm flattered that she even calls me her sister. But this is a mission for us to understand our commonality. Our commonality. I have photos. I showed you that photo of me and the little grandchild. There's no difference between the two of us. There's no difference between us. And the perception that people have. They say, oh, well, you're not Black if your hair is straight. Well, I have pictures when I was in the United States and ran my advertising agency, and I used to straighten my hair. And guess what? They still call me Black. Hello.
I was just keeping track of time.
Okay.
Patricia,
Sorry.
thanks again. Thanks again.
I wanted them to see her all the way in Mexico, and because there were slides, so I wanted them to see her beautiful face. So you can take it over, Jorge. You did a great job, all of you. It's an honor for me to. I mean, I've seen you grow up, Jorge, and I mean, this is very incredible work that you've been doing. I think we've been doing this for about 12 years or more, huh? So thank you very much. And thank you, Patricia. And we will be seeing you soon and for our virtual conference. Thank you.
Power to the people.
All power to the people.
Dona Gis está allí, tiene unas palabras y quiere compartir, Dona Gis, para cerrarnos. Está muteado el sonido. A ver,
Hola, ¿me escuchas?
Ahora sí.
Ok, bueno, gracias a todo el equipo por pues esa actividad y por hacer un recordatorio de la importancia que tenemos la población afrodescendiente en todo el mundo. En el caso particular de México, seguimos trabajando para visibilizarnos y para luchar por nuestros derechos.
So she's saying, Dona Gis said, thank you everybody for watching this. Thank you everybody behind who put this together. This movement continues to continue to visibilize this movement and bring justice to our communities. Dona Gis, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Espero haya podido hacerle justicia a todo el trabajo que han hecho ustedes. Desde aquí, desde lejos, hacemos nuestra parte. Y ahora vamos a invitar a todos los que están escuchándonos que sean parte de una discusión. So at this moment, I want to invite everybody who's still watching, who's still in tune. And if you have just anything to say, please join the conversation. You'll find the link now on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, YouTube, the National Conflict Resolution, we'll be hosting a group discussion so that we can continue this conversation about, reflections from the presentations and things you saw, but also about your process of trying to understand and cover your history and your story. So please join us. So if those of you who are with NCRC, Carla and the team, who's actually my wife, who's working with National Conflict Resolution, if you could share the link now so that we can end here and then go to the link, which is going to be shared. It's a Zoom link. It's going to be shared on the discussion in comments. So let's go ahead and do that. Before we leave, I want to just leave you with this last screen. And just to remind people that the conversation doesn't end here, that please continue to, I would recommend following these groups to find out more. I know there's much more out there, but these are some of the groups where you'll find more information on the topic, on contemporary politics of inclusion of the Black communities in Mexico and what's next. So please go there and stay informed, share it with your friends. But go ahead now, and for those of you who are still listening, join us in this discussion. I'm going to be joining it. So I hope to see you there. For those of you who are there, the Worldbeat Center, thank you all for all you're doing, all you do to heal the world through music, art, and science. I'm blessed and honored to be part of the team. As always, I've learned and continue to learn so much from you all. And again, I'm used here as a messenger, continuing that promise I made to Father Glenn Jemmett years ago, to keep the movement alive, visible, and also hopefully this gets to those in power in Mexico, the legislators who can change policy, to the president, who can bring in funds to these communities immediately. Just like we have funding for the indigenous communities, we need funding and structures to support the development and bring awareness of the Black presence in Costa Chica, so that our brothers and sisters don't have to get deported and sing the national anthem and question their identity as Mexicanos. So I hope this gets to the right people in power.
Also tomorrow, Israel
Yes.
Radio, 3 p.m. And,
That's right.
Yeah.
More information at the Worldbeat Center's Facebook page. Tomorrow we'll have Israel Reyes Larrea, who has been also in the front lines and historian through the lens. He has taken pictures and documented this movement very close. Today I shared a few of his pictures. The picture of the flyer is his, in fact. So join us tomorrow. The conversation continues. So With that being said, let's now move into the National Conflict Resolution discussion by clicking on that link on Zoom below. And for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, please go ahead and share this with your friends and family members. Thanks again, Makeda.
Love you, Jorge. Mucho gusto.